On the 15th of February 1942, in a single afternoon, the British Empire suffered what is still widely regarded as the worst defeat in its military history. Singapore, the fortress city meant to anchor Britain's power across Southeast Asia, surrendered to a Japanese force that had advanced faster and fought harder than anyone in London had thought possible. More than 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops laid down their arms that day. What almost none of them understood, standing in formation as their officers negotiated the terms of surrender, was that the battle they had just lost was, in some terrible sense, the easier part of what was coming. Within months, tens of thousands of those same men would be marched, shipped, and forced into cattle trucks toward camps in Thailand and Burma to build a railway through some of the densest jungle on Earth. Japanese engineers who had surveyed the route before the war estimated the project would take 5 years to complete safely. Under the men who would actually oversee its construction, it was finished in about 15 months. The question this story answers is not whether that railway got built. It did, on schedule, through mountains and jungle that should have made the deadline impossible. The question is what that timeline actually cost the men who built it, and why so many of them never went home to tell anyone about it. The fall of Singapore did not end the war for the men who surrendered there. It began a different one, fought not against an armed enemy, but against starvation, disease, and a captor who viewed surrender itself as a source of shame rather than misfortune. In Japanese military culture, a soldier who allowed himself to be captured rather than dying in battle had forfeited any claim to honorable treatment. That belief, more than any single order or policy, shaped how tens of thousands of Allied prisoners would be treated over the following 3.5 years. British, Australian, Dutch, and American servicemen captured across Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies found themselves classified not as defeated soldiers protected by the rules of war, but as men who had already disgraced themselves by surviving. By mid-1942, Japanese planners had identified an urgent strategic problem. The sea routes supplying their forces in Burma were increasingly vulnerable to Allied submarines and aircraft, and a land connection through Thailand had become a military necessity. The solution was a railway line roughly 258 miles long, cutting through the Kwai River Valley, connecting Ban Pong in Thailand to Thambuzaят in Burma. To build it fast enough to matter, Japanese command turned to the largest workforce available to them. More than 60,000 Allied prisoners of war, alongside as many as 200,000 Asian laborers recruited or conscripted from across the region, were assigned to the project. Roughly 30,000 of the Allied prisoners were British. They would spend the next year and a half hacking a rail bed out of solid rock, bridging rivers with hand tools, and laying track through terrain that had defeated every previous attempt at development. There was no single description of daily life on the railway, because conditions varied enormously between camps depending on terrain, weather, and the individual guards in charge. But certain elements repeated themselves at nearly every site along the line, and together they explain why survival itself became an achievement. Work quotas were set by engineers who cared about completion dates, not human limits. Prisoners were expected to move a fixed volume of earth or rock each day, regardless of whether they were healthy, injured, or already suffering from dysentery and fever. Falling short of the quota routinely brought physical punishment, and as deadlines tightened in 1943, the hours grew longer and the quotas grew harsher rather than the reverse. Food was calculated to keep men alive long enough to work, not to keep them healthy. The standard ration was a portion of boiled rice supplemented with small, often spoiled amounts of meat or fish, frequently contaminated with the very insects and rodent droppings that should have disqualified it from being served at all. Clean drinking water was scarce at many camps, forcing men to drink from the same rivers and streams that carried waste from the camps upstream. The combination proved catastrophic. Malnutrition left men without the reserves to fight off tropical disease, and disease, in turn, left them too weak to meet the work quotas that determined whether they ate at all. Dysentery and diarrhea alone accounted for more than a third of all deaths recorded along the railway. Cholera moved through camps in outbreaks that could kill a man within a day of his first symptoms. Malaria was so widespread that in some labor camps, more than half the prisoner population carried an active infection at any given time. Beriberi, a disease caused by vitamin deficiency that most of these men had never even heard of before the war, caused their legs to swell and their hearts to fail. Medical supplies to treat any of it were almost non-existent. Camp doctors, many of them fellow prisoners pressed into service, with whatever training and equipment they could scavenge, performed surgery with tools that would have been considered inadequate for veterinary use, and treated tropical ulcers that had eaten down to the bone with little more than boiled water and improvised bandages. If there was a single stretch of the railway's construction that came to define its horror, it was the deployment of what became known as F-Force in the middle of 1943. 7,000 Australian and British prisoners, many of them already weakened by illness before they even departed, were sent from the relatively stable camp at Changi toward remote work sites deep in the Thai jungle, on the understanding from Japanese officers that conditions at their destination would be manageable. That assurance turned out to be false in nearly every respect. The camp's F-Force arrived at Sat far from any reliable medical support, deep in terrain that made resupply of food and medicine desperately difficult, right as the monsoon season turned the jungle into a landscape of mud, flooding rivers, and standing water that bred disease at an accelerating rate. Within a single year, roughly 44% of F-Force did not survive. Nearly half of 7,000 men gone in 12 months, from a combination of overwork, starvation, and disease that their bodies had no reserves left to fight. It was during this same period that the railway's most notorious stretch of construction took place, a cutting through solid rock that prisoners nicknamed for the fires that lit the work site through the night, as exhausted men were forced to labor in what became known as speedo periods. Stretches of accelerated work with no rest days, driven by guards under pressure to meet deadlines set by engineers who were nowhere near the jungle themselves. One British officer who survived the railway later described it in terms that captured what statistics alone cannot. Men died, he wrote, from starvation, from the climate, from exhaustion, from accident, from disease, and from despair, and occasionally from direct physical assault. He was careful to note that the worst of the suffering was not always the product of deliberate cruelty. Often it was the result of indifference, of a system that simply did not account for the cost in human life required to meet an engineering schedule. Alongside disease and starvation, prisoners on the railway faced a system of discipline that treated ordinary human limits as defiance. Guards, drawn from both Japanese and Korean units assigned to oversee the workforce, were themselves operating under enormous pressure from officers demanding faster progress, and that pressure was passed down the chain of command in the most direct way available: physical punishment of the men doing the digging. Slapping, beatings, and forced standing in the sun for hours were common responses to failing a work quota, being caught resting without permission, or simply drawing the attention of a guard having a bad day. Escape was, in practical terms, almost impossible to attempt and nearly always fatal when tried. The camps were surrounded not by walls or fences in most cases, but by hundreds of miles of dense, disease-ridden jungle in every direction, populated by a civilian population under Japanese occupation with little ability to help an escaped prisoner survive, let alone reach Allied lines. Men who did attempt escape and were recaptured faced execution, and the threat of that consequence was often extended collectively, with entire groups warned that one man's attempt would be answered with punishment for all. What emerged from this combination of forced labor, deliberate punishment, and institutional indifference to survival was a death rate that set the Burma Railway apart even among the already brutal record of Japanese-run POW camps throughout the region. Roughly 27% of Allied prisoners held by Japan died in captivity over the course of the war, compared to a death rate of around 4% for Allied prisoners held by Germany. On the railway specifically, close to 1 in 5 Allied prisoners who worked on its construction did not survive to see it completed. On the 16th of October 1943, the two ends of the line met, and the railway that Japanese engineers had once estimated would take 5 years was declared complete after roughly 15 months of construction. By the time the last section of track was laid, the human cost behind that timeline had become almost impossible to calculate with precision, though the estimates that survive are staggering on their own. Approximately 12,800 Allied prisoners of war died during the railway's construction, out of more than 60,000 who worked on it. Among the Asian laborers conscripted or recruited for the same project, the death toll is estimated at as many as 90,000, out of a workforce of roughly 200,000, a rate of suffering that in many ways exceeded even what the Allied prisoners endured, and that has received far less historical attention as a result. The railway itself, once completed, functioned for the remainder of the war as a supply line for Japanese forces fighting in Burma, though Allied bombing later damaged significant sections of the track and bridges the prisoners had built at such catastrophic cost. In practical military terms, the line's usefulness to Japan lasted less than 2 years. The human cost of building it would be measured for the rest of the lives of every survivor. For the men who survived the railway, liberation did not arrive as a single moment of relief. It arrived gradually, often confused with rumor and disbelief, as Japan's surrender in August 1945 slowly reached camps scattered across Thailand and Burma that had, in some cases, gone months without any reliable information about how the wider war was progressing. What liberating forces found when they finally reached these camps shocked even soldiers who had already seen years of combat. Men in their 20s and 30s who weighed less than 100 pounds, skin stretched over visible ribs and collarbones, tropical ulcers that had never properly healed, survivors who had watched friends, fellow soldiers, and in many cases men they had known since childhood die slowly beside them, from diseases that basic medicine could have treated, had circumstances allowed it. In the years after the war, the survivors of the Burma Railway carried their experience home largely without the language or public framework to process it. Many rarely spoke about what they had endured, even to their own families. Post-war war crimes trials convicted a number of Japanese officers and guards responsible for conditions on the railway, and a smaller number were executed. But for most survivors, no verdict could restore what those 15 months had taken. What has endured instead is memory carried forward through memoirs, war cemeteries along the length of the old rail line, and museums built at sites like Hellfire Pass that now draw visitors from around the world each year, standing where prisoners once stood, working by firelight, under a deadline set by men who would never see the jungle themselves. The Death Railway was never, in the end, primarily a story about engineering, though it was an engineering feat completed against odds that should have made it impossible. It was a story about what happens when a military command decides that a deadline matters more than the lives required to meet it, and about the men who were forced to absorb that decision with their own bodies. British prisoners captured at Singapore did not choose the fate that followed their surrender. They inherited a system that viewed their captivity itself as a form of dishonor, and that indifference translated, day after day, into starvation rations, untreated disease, and punishment for the simple failure to move fast enough while dying of dysentery in 100-degree heat. That roughly 1 in 5 of them did not survive to see the railway completed is not simply a statistic. It is the measured cost of 15 months, multiplied across tens of thousands of men, in a jungle far from anyone who could help them, doing work that outlived its military usefulness within 2 years of being finished. The railway still exists in places today, walked by tourists and remembered at war cemeteries that hold thousands of graves. What it represents has not changed since 1943. It is what happens when human endurance becomes the raw material for someone else's timetable, and what it costs the men who are asked to supply it.